Let me just begin by saying that, as I've mentioned before, I collect sub-Saharan African stamps. There's a whole story behind how that started. Um, and I collect both mint, but mostly postally used stamps. I'm not much for CTOs. And so I have a particular affinity for the countries in the Sahel, which across just below the Sahara Desert. And Chad is one of those countries. And so um, one of the reasons I am interested in these countries is it's sort of hard, relatively speaking, to get stamps from them. So I want to tell you a little story about how I got a letter from Abéché, Chad, and the French, as the French spell it, T-Chad here. First of all, where is Chad? Chad is right here, sometimes called the dark heart of Africa. It's really smack dab in the middle of Africa. You know, it's dark because it's had a lot of problems over its history. Although, it's sitting right now near a desert, that part of the world was not a desert some time ago. When I mean by some time ago, I mean about 14,000 to 5,000 years ago. That was called the African Humid Period. And as you can see here, that the brown here represents something that looks more or less like this, a savanna. So the Sahara Desert was once upon a time, not, 5,000 years ago is about when civilization started. And 10,000 years ago is when agriculture originated. So, this is within the realm of sort of human existence, if you will. And you'll see right in the middle here is this great big blue thing, and that is Lake Chad. And that's where Chad gets its name from, Lake Chad. And so the current extent of Lake Chad is shown here, surrounded by red. But during this humid period, it used to be of this extent. And all of this is important for me to tell you because Chad has some of the richest archaeological sites in Africa. You might not, I didn't really know this. I mean, it's sort of sitting in the middle of Africa. It's now a desert, and I didn't realize that it actually has a rich archaeological history, and that's because once upon a time, Africa was not a desert. I mean, Chad was not a desert. It was actually more of a savanna. So, for example, it's the site of these stone pictures, which come from the Enedi Plateau, which is located right here in Chad. This is kind of what it looks like, what one part of it looks like. And these pictures are from about, I think, 7,000 years ago, and they're immortalized in this set of stamps here and from 1967 and 1968. And let me just say, by the way, that before making this presentation, I did not know anything about Chad history. I had these stamps, and I didn't much know what they were, why they were. So, and that's true for almost everything I'm telling you now. I have, Africa is 54 countries, and I really haven't taken the time to learn the history of many of them. So this was an opportunity for me to learn something about Chad. So everything I'm telling you now is recently acquired information. Okay, so this set of stamps from 1967 and 68 then depicts some of these stone carvings that were from that part of Chad. Another very important discovery was this skull, not just a skull, but some other bones of what's now called Sahelanthropus tachensis or chadensis, which the president of Chad nicknamed Tomai, which is a name given to children born just before the dry season, sort of hope of life. And the idea was this was sort of, and it's remarkable. It's basically, it was discovered in 2002, and it represents it's 7 million years old and represents an extinct hominid species discovered in sort of the northwest of Chad. And in 2002, right after it was discovered, Chad published this interesting series of stamps, you know, with the skull in different colors. And it has here the name given to it by the president of Chad, Tumai. And of course, it says ancestor of humanity, which is not exactly true. This is certainly it's an extinct version of humans. But its claim to fame supposedly is one of the first examples of bipedalism. The monkeys walk on all fours, and supposedly, and it's quite controversial, this was one of the first examples of a hominid that actually walked on 2 feet. Again, whether that's really true or not is a subject of controversy, as I understand it, in the archaeological world. Now, Lake Chad, which used to occupy much of Chad, has shrunk considerably, and it continues to shrink. This is one of my favorite sets of stamps. It's actually extremely hard to get. I bought this set from a dealer in Ukraine, actually, believe it or not, and I've never actually seen it for sale ever again. I have a couple of used versions of this 300 franc stamp and the 500 franc, but I've never seen any of the other ones in used form, and frankly, never seen this set for sale ever again. So I really love this particular set, and I also think it's pretty charming. And it's really basically talking about here, sort of saving the Lake Chad. It's all about trying to recover it somehow.
Do those black markings on the edges of the stamps have any particular meaning?
Those aren't black markings, actually. Those are cutouts,
Cutouts?
actually.
Oh, I
Those
see.
are cutouts of the stamps, and I've seen that in some stamps, not many, and I have no idea what the function is. But I've seen them in a few other countries have done it, but they're cutouts in the stamp.
It makes counterfeiting more difficult.
Yeah, that would be make sense.
It could be a version of what they call syncopated perforations, which are more difficult to imitate, I guess.
Also, to take it off an envelope, they made it so it would rip.
So in Nigeria, they use holograms. Now, stamp counterfeiting in Nigeria is a real problem, actually. There's lots of counterfeit stamps, and they're sort of fun to collect. But now they put little hologram, used to anyway, on the stamp to make that more difficult as well. So here's sort of the political history of Chad, if you will. Phil talked a year ago, which is how I found this this organization about West Africa. Um, Chad is part of what's called what the French had called Equatorial Africa. Basically, it was first, I don't know what you want to call it, colonized in 1900 by the French, and they sort of, started on the coast here, then worked their way up. And in about 1900, they finally got to Chad, created Fort Lamy, which is now the capital of Chad, is now N'Djamena. But it took them about 20 years to finally make it all the way up to here. And of course, these borders reflect, have no reality in terms of the people's the political history or anything else. They're just convenient. And this particular border with Cameroon keeps switching, or it used to switch back and forth. But so here it is, and this is now Central African Republic, this part right here. So here's Chad, and again, the country, basically, this was France sort of occupied it and kind of forgot about it. One thing I read claimed that no one was too demented or corrupt to make it impossible for them to be an administrator in Chad. It was really a backwater for the French. And then in 1958, they became a republic and then was granted full independence in 1960, around the same time that almost all colonies in Africa became independent. Now, Chad has problems. You can see it here. It's considered a failed state. It's low on the list of human development. It's basically been in a constant state of civil war, whatever, ever since it became independent. So here's just a brief summary of some of the main events in Chad's history. It became independent in 1960. Very shortly thereafter. I should say that it's divided between the north, which is mostly Muslim, and the south, which is predominantly Christian. So the country is divided into about 50% Muslim, about 45% or so Protestant and Catholic, and the rest sort of animist. And there's this constant tension between Muslims and the Christians. And I should say, as I was thinking about this and thinking about our own country, this, is true for a lot of African countries. You have this tension between tribal groups in Cameroon. It's between the English speaking and the French speaking, and this is a continuing tension. And now in our own country, it's now we're seeing the same sort of thing happening, but it's the function of the history of many countries in Africa. So anyway, in 1965, the northern Muslim groups started guerrilla warfare against the Christian South. In 1979, they captured the capital, and Habré becomes the president. And in around this time, Libya, which is just, of course, to the north, annexes this strip at the top of the country. And that annexation then has caused a lot of problems, despite the fact it's in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and you would wonder why anybody would care about having this narrow strip of land. But anyway, so Libya annexes it, and then eventually Libya extends pretty much all the way through half of the country. And in about 1983-84, Libya is advancing basically. It pretty much wants to capture the whole country. And at some point, Chad says, we're not interested in this. And they enlist the help of the US and the French, and they fight back. And eventually, they defeat the Libyans, and this strip is returned to Chad. In 1990, Habré is overthrown by his general. I mean, this goes back and forth, constant warfare, constant civil wars with little intermediate periods of peace. And if you look at the stamps, I think Chad has published more stamps of liberation, peace, people getting together. I think trying to inspire folks to that state, but has never seemed to work. And then in 2025, the French leave Chad. And here is a stamp. I always wondered what this stamp was about. This is a stamp in 1985, and now having prepared the strip, this Ajout strip, it has different names. Here it's Oju, I guess, but here at other place it's Azuzu. It's this little narrow strip of land across the top of Chad, right up here. And I guess this stamp represents the idea that people from all around Chad are trying to annex it. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not exactly sure the symbolism here, but this is quite obvious. Here's Libya as some falcon's claw. Here's a human hand fighting back. I think there's no doubt what the symbolism of this particular stamp is. This is leading up to I'm getting to my letter here. I'll reach it in a bit here. Okay. One thing I learned about was something called the Toyota War. And this is the name for this war when Chad was fighting against Libya, right? And the French got involved, and they call it Operation, I don't speak French, but how would you pronounce it? Épervier, began in 1986. And basically the French decided to, help the Chadians out in this fight. And they donated 400, Toyota mini trucks. Sometimes you see pictures of these things. If you see, these mini trucks with a machine gun load mounted on it. So the French provided that to the Chadians. And here's the important point: the French established new bases at Biltien and Abéché. Okay, and they also built an airstrip at Abéché in about 1987. Okay, so in 87, they attacked this Libyan outpost in Fada, which is the northeastern capital of Chad, and they triumphed over Libyans. They killed 781 of them and destroyed 100 tanks, and Gaddafi was very upset about this, of course. And very quickly, they published this set of stamps. And I have to say, this is one of my favorite sets of stamps. Also very difficult to get. It took me a long time to get the purple one in the middle one, the 100-franc one. And I've only gotten the used versions of these. I've never seen mint versions, or the mint versions would sell for something like $400. And I'm not willing to pay that much for a set of stamps. But finally, I got this complete set, and I actually have duplicates, so I'm very happy about that. But now I know what this is representing. It's representing the commemorating the liberation of Fada from the Libyans. And in 1988, basically, the war came to an end, and Libya gave up its claims on Chad, and the strip went to Chad. So that's all the background for this story. Now, again, here's our picture of that, and Abéché is located right about there in Chad, right, at the upper end of the Sahel zone. The Sahel zone is this zone that's sort of part desert, part not desert, with trees in it. Above here, there's no trees, but here there's sort of some trees. And Abéché is a town of about 45,000 people. It's considered pretty large because if you look at a map of Chad, you'll see that it's indicated on the map, so it's big enough to be indicated on maps of Chad. And this is what the city looks like from Google, and that's where the post office is, right there. So there's the post office located right smack dab in the middle of the city. So in about 2017 or so, I saw these covers available for sale on Delcampe. I don't know if any of you buy stamps on Delcampe, but Delcampe is the sort of a European version of eBay. And that's where I buy almost all of my stamps from, because the French collect stamps from Africa, as do the British, and they sell them on this site, Delcampe. And so I pretty much buy all my stamps on Delcampe. And these covers became available, and there was a little bidding war for them. But I thought, whoa, covers from Chad. Now you'll notice that these stamps here have nothing to do with the history of Chad, and they're from a period. So the history of African philately is pretty much, they published stamps that had something to do with the country, with a few things that didn't have anything to do with the country up until about middle of 1990s, about 1995. And then there was this period, which was true from across Africa. I don't know if it's true elsewhere in the world, that American companies and companies from Europe came in and said, look, if you let us publish stamps that are appeal to European and American stamp collectors, we'll publish a few stamps that you can use for your own, and we'll pay for it. So they started then flooding the market, as some of you know, with stamps that, like with Marilyn Monroe and other stamps that have no relation to the country. Okay, but they were sold in the country, and I know this because I've gotten stamps from another dealer from Rwanda who goes around Africa and sometimes sends me covers, and they often are these sort of thematic issues. Anyway, so I bought these stamps. I won the bidding war for them. And then I was fascinated by them. So I wrote an email in 2017 to the guy I bought these stamps from. And so here's my email. I said, these stamps, envelopes from Chad, were sent to you, presumably by yourself, because they're all addressed to this one guy. Where did you get them from? Did you get the stamps locally? Did you bring them in did you buy them online? And I said, I'm fascinated by Sahelian countries. I can't imagine that their postal systems actually work. And I say, hopefully, someday I hope to meet someone who will send me a letter or letters from Mali, Chad, or Niger. Best wishes, Scott. So this is July 12th. And on July 17th, I get thanks for your message. And he sends me some photographs of Chad, which I'll show you in just a second. The first two is a letterbox from the French military camp in Abéché, where sometimes I've had a job. And he talks about this International Service of Defense, SPID, which I'll tell you about in just a second. And then he shows me some pictures of the post office in Abéché and a picture of him with the postmaster. And so he says, here, I buy the stamps from the post office and I send myself the covers. Sometimes they don't arrive. And there's very little quantity of covers very rarely from village. The postal system works very badly, no money, a desolation. If you want, and if I return to the town, I will be able to send mail for you. No problem. It's more difficult. Okay, so I get this email. I ask him some more questions like, who are you? What do you do? And he says, I work for a semi-private company and support for the army. He's not military. He does maintenance, constructions, electricity, plumbing, air conditioning, waste, water. And he says the military presence in Abéché dates from the time of the colonies. That's sort of true, but basically, from what I could tell, it really was from the middle of this Toyota War. There's actually a town that the French have a base in even farther north. And then he mentions American, as he says, technicians, basically military folks who are in the capital of Chad. Okay, so here's Eric. Here's the picture he sent me, and this is the postmaster of that little post office in Abéché. Here's the military base, which is located right next to the post office, basically. So here's and again, this base was established. It has only about 100 soldiers or so. And here's the air. You can see up here. Here's the airfield that they built. So here's a picture of the post office. Okay, here's from the outside in downtown Abéché. Here's sort of inside, and here's somebody at the postal window. I don't know if he's really just hanging out or buying, smelling a letter. So there's two post offices there, actually. There's the Chilean post office, and then the French have a post office too, which is this SPID thing that he mentions with a little picture of a French soldier on the outside for decoration. Okay, so sometime in December 2018, this is about a little over 1.5 years later, I go to my mailbox in the biology department at the University of Pennsylvania. And what do I find but this letter addressed to me from Abéché, Chad. And I'm thinking, what a great Christmas present. Here it is, a letter to me from sort of the middle of nowhere, as far as I'm concerned, with a stamp, a Marilyn Monroe stamp, some dog stamps here, and some more dog stamps. And I think, all right, finally, I have a letter from Chad addressed to me. Very excited about this. One of my prized possessions. Okay, so in preparation for this talk, I emailed Eric again last week and I said, I'm doing this thing, do you have any other, information for me, whatever? I'm saying, do you remember me? And he says, yes, I remember you and I sent you a letter from Mali. He did send me a letter from Mali, but it was not actually a letter. I don't think I ever got a letter directly from him in Mali. I got a postcard from him in Mali, but I think it was sent from France. Anyway, he says, in 2020, he went to Abéché. He was stuck there for 6 months because of COVID. Then returned to France for 3 months and then came back for more than four. And he stopped going in 2002. And he says here, the post office barely functioned. Frankly, he was not allowed to leave the base. You know, the Africans do not like the French. In fact, they hate the French. And he wasn't allowed to leave the base. But he did say he was able to circulate a little mail from N'Djamena, which is the capital of Chad, but not from Abéché. They're only deployed a few times, and the same for you. Americans aren't popular either. And he says, this is his commentary about the US. The common people can hope that savings will be made. Wait and see, ha ha ha. I'm attaching a magazine where I wrote an article, and it concerns this military postal service in French. If you have any specific questions, I'll be happy to answer them if I have the answers. Best, Eric. So here, in fact, are the letters that he mailed from N'Djamena, which I had purchased some months before. He had these other covers, and man, I jumped on these immediately. Fortunately, I had no competition this time, so I bought them for the price he wanted, which was €7 a piece, which I figured was worth it, because as far as I was concerned, these are going to be the last letters ever to leave Chad or be available. And this one is particularly interesting for those of you interested in airplanes. Here's the, I guess, Boeing, and this is the front of the envelope or cover, and here's the back. So he has a whole series of Boeing pictures. I mean, there's different sets of stamps, each a different color, and I have them all. So I was very excited. I bought all of them, figuring this is my last chance to get covers from Chad, or at least recent covers from Chad. And here is the article that he published in the, I guess, Armed Postal History Society Journal. Little did I know that there's a journal on the postal history of military. Okay.
343 as well. It's been going for some time.
Yeah, it's been going for, but here's another interesting example, which just shows you something about African philately. So here's this article written by Eric, and the first author of this guy is a guy named Mark Perrin. Now, I know Mark Perrin well because I have bought covers from him, and I know him well because he always calls himself Dr. Perrin, and he actually has a PhD in forestry. He's Dutch, and he's one of these guys that has that I think his main thing is having covers and selling them or whatever. I mean, I don't know whether he really works, there's any work at all, because he always has covers on Delcampe. They're always €5, unless they're a little bit more rare, then they're up to €7 or whatever. And I've followed his career. I've searched for him online, and every 2 years he's with a different NGO that has to do with, environment or forestry or whatever. But his real love is philately, basically. And so, end of story. In January 11th, 2025, the French leave Abéché, and Turkey, believe it or not, takes over their camp. And so there are no more French in Abéché, or I don't think anywhere else in Chad. And frankly, there's no French. I don't know if you follow the history of Africa at all, but basically Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger have all kicked the French out. And I learned this just a week ago because I buy postcards from this American who has what's called Postcards from Timbuktu. And I don't know if you guys know about this, but as a sort of service to the tour guides in Timbuktu, which no one can go to Timbuktu anymore because it's too dangerous. For $15, you can get a former tour guide in Timbuktu to send you a postcard, postmark it, and you can either have it whatever you want it written on it, or they'll write something for you. And the postcard makes its way by bus formally to the capital of Mali, and then sent out from there. But now, get this, now the Malayans have usually, I didn't know how mail moved from Africa to around the world, but the way it moves apparently, or did move, was in the case of Mali or Chad, Air France would have a trip, I guess, once a week, and the mail would go to Paris, and then from Paris it would go around the world. But the Malians want nothing to do with the French, so they said, forget Air France. We're not sending our mail by Air France. They send it by Air Morocco to Morocco, and from Morocco it moves around the world. So there's no French anywhere else, anywhere in North Africa. The Africans are done with them, and they're no longer there. So no more letters from Abéché for me. End of story.
I noticed on some of the letters, the handwritten ones, the numeral 5 is made in what seems to me a very curious way. It looks almost like a letter S.
The French have very specific ways of writing numbers. For example, their 7 always has a line across the middle, and their 1s have, they're very, very accentuated. So
The ones have big flags.
the ones have big flags. I mean, it's really quite interesting.
My home address is 111 Jersey, and I get a lot of mail from France because of interest in the French area. And of course, it's addressed with the ones with the big flags. And so it inevitably goes to 777 Street and then has to make its way back to me.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I was surprised when I saw the addresses on some of your covers that they made it with the difference in the French numbers, because it often causes a lot of confusion.
Yeah. Well, it's true. I've missed some of my mail either doesn't make it or gets
Well,
sent.
you have added problems with all the wars and the infighting and
Yeah,
the
yeah,
changes in boundaries, and it goes
yeah,
on and on.
it's very, I mean, this guy, the American that has this service, about a week ago, I finally got a postcard from him, and he said the following. He said, look, it's very hard to do this anymore because, not only does Mali no longer send mail, but of course it comes to me in Senegal where he lives by bus. He says, and now the Senegalese are no longer mailing things to the US because of the US, this news tariffs. He said, so what I had to do is I had to take all my all my postcards, send them to my mother in Ohio by DHL, and who then so I got my postcard in an envelope mailed to me from Ohio, but originally postmarked in Timbuktu. I mean, I could tell you story after story after story about collecting stamps from Africa. This is a small subset sample of the interesting stories I have, but I buy a lot of kiloware if I can get it, which is harder and harder to get. But I bought some kiloware on African kiloware, and the first lot I got was amazing. It was like recent stamps from Africa. Most of them were addressed to this Wageningen place. And then I bought a second lot, and it was stolen from me. And I'm living in the center city, and I get an email from this guy about 10 blocks away saying, I found this box ripped open with your name on it, would you like it? I said, would you? I like it. Those are my stamps from Africa. These are very hard to get. Recent used African stamps are very difficult to get. So I grabbed a bottle of wine, rushed over to claim my. Fortunately, the folks who stole my box opened it up, discovered they were stamps I had no interest in, and threw it under a car. And he found it and had the good graces to find out whose it was addressed to. And I said, boy, am I interested in that. So anyway, that's one of my many stories about collecting African stamps.
Scott, are you still dealing with Delcampe
Oh yeah. Well,
actively now? Do you go through somebody? Because my last contact with them, they wouldn't ship to the U.S. because they would not collect U.S. sales tax.
well, no, usually it depends, More and more they say we do not ship to your country. But I buy a lot of my stamps from certain French dealers, and they just put them in an envelope and mail them with no indication that there's, high value things in there. I
More
mean,
general, yeah.
yeah, I mean, there is one dealer who sells kiloware, and I like him a lot. He's my favorite one because he sells, and I love, stamps on paper, which is a lot of fun. I like to take things off of paper, and he sells things very cheaply, and he often has really hard to get stamps. So, and he said, and I haven't bought anything recently, and I think he would be in trouble because he actually has to post because it's not just an envelope, it's a little package of stamps, and he has to put little customs things on it. I think it would be hard for me to get. He probably would not be able so I haven't been able. He hasn't actually posted anything I want recently, so but I think I would no longer be able to get stamps from him, unfortunately. Yeah, I have, you might think, just as an aside, you might think it's hard to get stamps from Chad, but this is my Chad album, and you can see every page looks like this. And I have duplicates of many stamps. So although Chad seems like it's out of the way, surprisingly, you can get stamps from there.